Well, welcome everyone to the Masculine Wilderness Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Perez. I am the founder and CEO of Epic Project. This podcast is an ongoing conversation about how men can show up in the world in the best version of themselves. And we cannot do it without the company, the wisdom, the leadership, the insight of women. And we've had the privilege over the last couple of years of having some pretty amazing women just speak into this subject that we focus on, just share their wisdom. And today is no exception. This is my new friend who I've heard about for years, but this is my new friend Josie Heyano from Alaska, who I recently met in Orlando, Florida, at a conference there. She is. I'm looking at her kind of her bio, and I'm not going to read it because it's extensive and it would just take up way too much time. But this is an accomplished leader, someone who, in my opinion, is a is an elder before her time. I think she's just got so much wisdom to offer us. But out of respect for her culture and tradition, and yeah, Josie, I want you to introduce yourself, and then we can circle back to some of the details. But would you please introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and we'll go from there.
Hi, Tom. Thank you. So my name is Josie Heyano. I am a Degaton Athabascan woman from Alaska. The way that we traditionally introduce ourselves here, that we're taught to introduce ourselves, is really about bringing forward not who we are and what we do, but where we come from and what that means to us. And remembering our responsibility to each other, that when I come to podcasts, when I come to presentations, when I come into a room, I don't come as an individual. I come as part of my ancestral line. I come as part of my community. I come as part of, bless you, having a deeper responsibility, to a larger group of people than just myself. And so the traditional introduction is really important, to be able to say that I am the granddaughter of the late Paul and Mary Starr from Tanana, Alaska. I'm also the granddaughter of the late Alfred Miller from the village of Anvik. And I'm also the granddaughter of Pete and Rosa Heyano from the village of Ecock, Alaska. My parents are Nina and David Heyano of Tanana and Ecock. And I currently live and reside on Denina lands here in Anchorage, Alaska.
I I love the way that just shapes the whole conversation, like where I'm from, where I come from. I had not heard you introduce yourself that way before. um, and it's just there's such a depth to it, and it speaks to the story that you carry with you. And I want to, yeah, my mind is racing in all kinds of different directions. I want to go. I want to come back to the story, but I also so let me do that by sharing a little bit of my story, like we talked about before we started recording. This whole thing is full circle for me. When I started Epic years ago, I was only a year or two into it, and my middle daughter, Joelle, got a job with the Yukon Kuskokwim Health Service.
Mhm.
Sure you're aware of. And she spent a year or so in Bethel, Alaska, which is I always use the phrase "on the way to nowhere," but that's really I mean it's an island, right? I mean it's
Mhm.
functionally unless the dead of winter and you can take the river to get but it's a very remote place. Anyway, I was there visiting her. She was a medical social worker. And I was visiting with her supervisors one day in their office in Bethel, and talking about what we were doing or trying to do at the time with Epic. And they said something that's always stuck with me about exploited people. They they said, yeah, that happens in these outlying Native Alaskan villages. Young girls and I think boys as well are recruited, groomed, and they find themselves in places like the streets of Anchorage,
Mhm.
and other larger cities in that area. And what was so startling for me was the realization that this happens everywhere.
Mhm.
Um, can you can you just shed some light on that in the Alaskan context? Because that's really where your work is. You're a social worker,
Mhm.
therapist by trade and training and expertise, award winning too.
Mhm.
You received some pretty prestigious, I think, awards and recognition for your work. But talk about what that exploitation looks like in and around Alaska. What's the scope of it there?
Well, if your daughter ever wants to be social work friends and talk about her experience in medical social work in Alaska, I would love to do that because mental health and wellness in Alaska is a very near and dear part of my heart and my work and what I um, practice in my professional life. And I can't imagine that experience was particularly easy for anyone who is in a rural social work, medical social work setting in Indigenous communities. So that offer is extended if she
Yeah,
ever
you would.
to have coffee.
Yeah, yeah.
um, so I think you really said what many of us in the state have been saying for a long time is that there is um, this prevalence in Alaska of human trafficking. And those of us who work in this space and in this field have known that for a long time. And those who experience it have known it for a long time. But, to this day, I can go into social services agencies, schools, police departments, and talk about this. And there's still an element of surprise or even disbelief, or where I think that people don't want to believe that that's happening here, which is not uncommon, but it's a hard thing to navigate sometimes. And I'll share, I think one of the most kind of like shocking moments in my early social work career was working with youth experiencing homelessness, and I was working in a shelter setting. And we had to do some training on human trafficking because they had just been awarded a lot of federal funding and they were going to stand up some human trafficking programs in the shelter. And so we were taking some trainings, and one of the videos that we had to watch was a short video, but it was put out with some local law enforcement and the FBI. And so the special agent in charge at the time in the video had said, that they had had a lot of interviews with people who were traffickers in Alaska. And one of the things they had come to know was that there was a really common term called tundra pimping, which was a very specific type of intentional targeting of Alaska Native girls who were from rural communities and were displaced in urban settings. And so it wasn't just something that like we knew this was happening a lot, but it was something that was so known, um, so methodical that it actually had its own brand, right? It was tundra pimping. Like we are intentionally going into these urban hubs looking for displaced rural girls and boys. And so that I remember like feeling upset and validated in that moment of like, no, this is really an intentional targeting of our people. It's not just this one-off thing that's happening, which like my own personal experience can attest to that. And then my experience working victim services, that's what we saw day in and day out. Like it wasn't these accidental things or a series of misfortunate events that people fell into. It was really blatant, intentional targeting. And one thing that I think that people in Alaska still haven't fully grasped is that so many of the people who come here to harm our people are not from here. The people that had come up with the tundra pimping term, those were people from, large organized crime syndicates from in the lower 48, and they were coming to Alaska and are still coming to Alaska really specific.
Specifically for that.
Mhm. And so I think that's one thing that I've always landed on that I try to stress in our community, the urgency of there's a real systematic organization to this
Mm.
that I don't think that we're giving enough credit to. And I don't think our response is urgent enough. Um,
Still,
mm, Still, yeah.
yeah. How many years have you been in this work as a social worker, advocate? How long have you been kind of in the trenches on this?
Um, I'd say about 8, 9-ish.
Okay.
Really started off working human services degrees, working youth homelessness. It was funny, I had an advisor at the time in social work, and I was getting ready for my practicum, and he said, "Well, which population do you least want to work with?" And I was like, "Teens, 100%. They terrify me." And so, being who he was, Bob Parr, if you're out there, said, "Well, that's exactly who you should be working with then.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
try it out." And so came to learn that that's just an incredible group of people to work with,
Yeah.
and probably the funniest group of people to work with. And also, I think in terms of humility, like it really has kept me humble as a social worker to work with teenagers every day and just be reminded I'm not cool, I'm not interesting, and I don't know it all.
Yeah. That's that. Yeah. Teenagers will do that to you. So you've been in this long enough to have some hope for change, and yet to see how deeply entrenched this problem is in the systems and structures
Yeah.
that you move about in now. And um, I want to come back to, like, how do we recapture that hope? We'll come back to that towards the end here. But can you talk a little bit about why, like, what are the roots of this that you see in Alaska? This exploitative um, mindset. Like, can you trace some of the lines that you see historically? In your own, in your own culture and communities, and just being a native Alaskan.
Um, well, a lot of that for me in my experience comes down to the shift that happened here in Alaska when there was first contact with white settlers.
Mm,
And the shift in cultural values and the shift in relational accountability. And you and I had chatted briefly about this before, but one of the things that continues to be a really large challenge for me as a anti-trafficking professional, and I put that in quotes because I have a hard time with that sometimes because I don't necessarily see my role as anti-trafficking,
yeah,
or the work that I do as anti-trafficking. I think trafficking is something that occurs within this work, but it's so much broader than that. But when we look at our traditional values as Native people and the way that we are raised to know that we are interconnected with everything around us. We are raised to know that we don't own anything. We are raised to know that what impacts someone else impacts us, that we are all intertwined, connected, and relational. And that we have these incredibly delicate and balanced relationships that are rooted in humility and stewardship and connection. Um, and I think that we live in a society currently that doesn't value most of those things.
mm,
And so it's really difficult for me to sit in rooms with people who are, screaming from the rooftops here, we have to do something about trafficking. And yet they're the same people who will continuously vote and promote the extraction of natural resources on tribal lands. They are, the same people who will say, we need more oil, we need more drilling. They're the same people who will say, um, that some of these sacred lands to our Indigenous people here don't matter. And it's that same mindset of ownership, of extraction, of having a right to something, whether it's a person or a river or a land, like this idea that you have a right to own, um, to control, to have power over, and to extract from
mm,
is a mindset that, I think is entrenched in all of this. And when we talk about, how do we build healthier communities as prevention, as intervention for human trafficking, like, I think it has to start there. It
yeah,
has to start with where did we get so disconnected and so individualized, that we don't see these everyday connections anymore?
yeah, yeah. That's so deeply rooted. How do you, in the midst of that, because I hearing you unpack it, like, I can totally see how that plays out, and I know it plays out in places other than just
Yeah.
Alaska. But, like, how do you keep your equilibrium? How do you keep your
Yeah.
sanity in the midst of that? How do you keep going? Because
Yeah.
that feels like, a really, really strong current that you're pushing it.
Mhm. Mm. Yeah, it is. And I was actually thinking back to this morning before we got on together. I was thinking back about to my time with Lauren and the data summit we did in Alaska, and I remember being so overwhelmed to go on stage and give a keynote and kind of it was my first time really speaking publicly to my community about my experiences and this like really overwhelming fear about it. And I remembered this quote from Abigail Echohawk, who's the I believe she's still the executive director of the Urban Indian Health Institute in Seattle, and they do some incredible work around data. She's also on the board of some organizations here in Alaska. But she has a quote, and I'm going to butcher it right now. But it's something along the lines of, indigenizing spaces isn't showing up with, feathers in my hair and regalia. It's showing up with my heart on fire and my big ass indigenous earrings and heels and demanding to be heard. And um, that permission for taking up space, that permission for anger has been something that has really driven me in the past few years. And I see that in so many other, especially Native women who are leading in spaces. Like it's really inspiring to use anger to be the fire that drives you to keep doing the work. And I think we somewhere along the line learned that our anger is not allowed and it's not well and it's not a good part of us. And actually, a large part of my therapeutic work is, you know, helping women can reconnect with anger, reconnect with like, I'm actually mad about this, and I'm going to go on the stage and I'm going to talk about this because I'm really upset, and that's okay. And it's okay for me to hold that anger. And I
Yeah.
remember, for me, it all comes full circle. I had a supervisor when I was working in youth shelters who, really amazing person. And he had said to me one time, sometimes your fire is a little much. You have to stop trying to burn things down. And I remember feeling so like crestfallen by that because it was that same fire that felt like this is my energy.
Yeah.
This is what fuels this. And combined with it is love. And combined with it is wonderful things, but rooted in there is some really strong anger. And I think that's actually a really beautiful thing. And it's a really protective thing. Like my anger comes from places that are valid. My anger comes from places that keep me safe, that should be allowed. And so it's probably not the like the prescribed answer people would give for like what keeps you balanced, but I have come to a place in my life where like my anger feels like such a good sign that I'm on the right track in my advocacy, that I'm in a space that I should be, and I can use it for energy.
I'm listening to you as a woman unpack this and talk about the anger that you bring. And there's some dissonance for me because as a man,
Mhm.
when I show up, or men in general, but I know from from my own direct experience, when I show up as an angry man, it typically doesn't go well. And that's one of the things that men, and I think it's a fair criticism, men are, we're criticized for, you know, uh, doing so many destructive things because of that, maybe more
Right.
undisciplined anger. I just kind of playing a devil's advocate here, but why is it good for you
Mhm.
as a woman to acknowledge and kind of stand in that anger?
Mhm.
Why is it constructive for you, and yet it tends to be more destructive for men? Why would you, or is that a false distinction?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's fair for you to say that. And I think the distinction for me would be, in my experience as a woman, getting mad is dangerous. Getting mad is
Mm.
women get mad and we get killed. And I think the difference is men get mad and they kill people. And that's a strong, strong statement, but I say that with, there's a really big power differential there. And I think I learned early in my life, many women learn earlier in their life to bury anger and to not hold anger because it sometimes is not received well. And sometimes the outward display of anger is dangerous for our well-being, our lives, our children's well-being, our family's well-being. And so it is protective to hold in that anger. And so for me, anger is a point of defiance that I won't hold that in, and that I will challenge, and that I will say the things that potentially will make other people uncomfortable because I don't want to hide that part of me anymore.
Yeah.
So I think that might be the difference. That's the way I see it.
It's such an indictment, and I can't disagree with it. But like you said, when women get hopefully I get this correct. When women get angry, they get killed, and when men get angry, they kill people.
Mhm,
I know that's a generalization, but
mhm.
things that are generalized are
Yeah.
generally truthful.
Yeah, I mean, they're rooted in something. I mean, we look at what the number one cause of death for pregnant women in America is. It's homicide. Who is most likely to kill women? It's our intimate partners. I mean, by um, the data itself, like even if we were to look at the sexual assault and rape violence data in Alaska, which by the way is um, usually at least 3 times the national average. We have, I've grown up my whole life hearing our statistics, hearing the data on just how much domestic violence, sexual assault we have here. And those statistics all boil down to um, intimate partner violence
Yeah.
and violence perpetrated by men against women. And it doesn't say that the violence doesn't happen the other way around or that it's exclusively this, but just from a protective stance, like to see that type of data, um, you have to come to the conclusion that men are the most dangerous thing for us. And so I
Well,
think that these types of conversations are particularly hard. I spent a lot of time this week thinking about how to come into this conversation in a good way, and to talk about men in communities. I'll be honest, this is probably one of the hardest conversations I've ever had in a podcast setting because I always go back to some of the evidence, and that's just the way my brain works.
yeah,
But
say more.
yeah,
Say
so I talk with I'm really fortunate to have a really cool network of Indigenous women from across the country that are doing a lot of advocacy with our missing murdered Indigenous relatives and human trafficking and intimate partner violence. And there's a really common theme that we talk about a lot. And it's these our mutual experiences of men in leadership positions being the most dangerous. And our mutual experiences of we all know people who are leaders in our community, who are either elected officials or they are in the drum line or they lead the dance group or they're traditional leaders who have harmed women. And one of the things that's really difficult about that is there's a silence that accompanies it because it's not safe to speak out against those people. And we go back to that anger conversation, right? I was so aware going into this podcast today that I have so much anger towards men in my community. And I can hold that anger and recognize I have, the social work part of my brain that understands, what other factors come into play to create an atmosphere where men harm women. Like I have this, I can look at the macro and the meso and the micro and think through the socioecological model. And then I have this heart part of me that says, I look around and I see people who demand respect, demand trust, demand to be in leadership who have hurt us.
yeah.
And they know that they have. And because it's not safe for our anger to be expressed, because we go unheard when it is, they get to maintain that privilege in our communities. And so I think it's really hard to invite men into the space when we have optically so many men in our space who don't deserve to be there and who
Well,
haven't earned the trust to be there. Um, so yeah,
is
that's the
that
hard thing.
yeah, and so you're referring there to
Mhm.
indigenous leaders. It's just indigenous men as a group. Is that kind of what you're talking about there?
Well,
Obviously,
no, I mean, I think just men in general. I think, one of my like earliest on experiences of harm when I was still a teenager um, was from men in my community, my Indigenous community, and I think there's a really distinctive type of hurt that came along with that,
Yeah.
uh, where there was something about growing up believing people to be protectors and believing people to be uncles and friends, and the same people who eat at your grandparents' tables and dance at the hall at potlatches with you, don't hesitate to hurt you. And so there's a really specific type of hurt there, but then I think what's progressed in my life is to see that over and over again replicated in different types of power dynamics.
Yeah.
I've seen that in law enforcement in Alaska. I
Mm.
can't tell you how many cases of law enforcement accusations have come up of harm to Indigenous women, harm to women in their leadership roles. Our elected officials, not just in state but nationally. I mean, we can't, as a community, have a conversation about people accused of or convicted of harm against women taking up leadership positions without looking at our current climate right now, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, and it's not, I want to go back again to, it's not just intimate partner violence and sexual exploitation and trafficking, it's everything.
Yeah.
And so, when I go back to that, I had a really vivid moment a few months back where one of my good friends, she's a wildlife biologist, an Indigenous woman, Michelle Quillen, absolutely brilliant, and she takes up space in predominantly white male environments within our Department of Fish and Game, our different boards that manage game and wildlife, and she goes into those spaces, and she asked me to come with her to one of them. Um, and I remember the feeling of watching a group of white men sit around a table and then watching her try to explain to them why why bald eagle, I'm not even making this up, why it was not a good idea to do predatory control on bald eagles, so getting rid of bald eagle hatchlings in order to increase the Dall sheep population. And so we're talking about a group of people who are appointed to a board as hunters. Most of them own lodges, most of them have stake in guided hunting. There's a huge economic um, advantage here,
Or
right?
more that extractive economy
Yes.
too, right?
Yes, right. And so we have this board of people who are the decision makers um, of this extractive economy, and this one lone Indigenous woman with her every degree um, you could possibly imagine to be the expert on this, not to mention a lifetime of ancestral knowledge that just tells her what she needs to know. And she could not convince them otherwise. And so I'm watching this woman fight for the lives of animals in our community up against money and dollars, and she didn't stand a chance.
Yeah.
They didn't hear a word that she said. And so I look at something like that and I say, this is exactly what we're talking about. This is
Yeah.
the same conversation that we have when we say, stop raping people, stop sexually assaulting people, stop domestic. Like, this is the same conversation. It's this idea of ownership and privilege and rights. And that's where I keep coming back to that lately. And I think especially now in our current climate, I don't know if you followed a lot of the executive orders that came out, but there was quite a few on Alaska. And so, one of them I think was even titled Unleashing the Economic Potential of Alaska. And one of the first lines in there said, drill, baby, drill. Yeah.
Yeah. I did. I am aware of that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If it doesn't hurt you somewhere to read that type of language about the land that we live on, about the land that we're connected to, then that's where the disconnect is.
Yeah. Yeah. That's just staggering. Yeah. And I'm listening to you as a woman, talk about the struggles that women face to simply express their anger in a way that doesn't get them killed or fired or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, I I wonder, have there been times, and if there haven't, that says something as well. But have there been times where you have been able to kind of show up with that anger, express it, and feel heard by men? And if so, what could I learn? What could the men that listen to this conversation learn about how to respect that when a woman expresses it? I mean, has there ever been an experience like that? And if the answer is no, then we can go a different direction because that says
Yeah.
something. Yeah. What?
Yeah, I think there has been, and I can think of a few examples of that. One thing that sticks out to me is even in our earlier conversation, your kind of first initial gut reaction was, well, I can't do that. Like as a man, I can't show up angry. And I think that's something to pay attention to, right? Like why do we immediately center ourselves and when what we see other people demonstrating? And I think that's a really common theme. Not just with men, but with all of us, right? When we feel like we're not able to do something and we watch someone else do it, instead of being able to just hear and appreciate what's being said, we have that sense of, well, I can't do that, or not me, or how come you can do that and I can't do that? And so I think even kind of decentering ourselves enough to be able to listen really well to people. And I've seen examples of that. I've I've gone up on stages and got a little ranty sometimes, and I've had men come up to me after and say, thank you for the work that you're doing in the community. And I will say there is, I speak really generally a lot of the time because, we go back to the data really does show us that generally there is a lot of harm being committed by men.
Yeah.
But we have some incredible people in our communities that are working really hard to try to undo that, to try to learn. And, especially our Indigenous men. Like I know of a few people who are leading groups and organizations, really grassroots in Alaska, where they're just trying to help men kind of find what their role is again in
Hmm.
society. And especially for Indigenous men, reconnecting to who they are within the context of their community and who women are and what their role is as protectors of women. And one of the most incredible things I've seen men do in that role is really just get out of the way sometimes, and be okay with that. And know that there are sometimes spaces that need to be women, and that's okay too. Um, Go ahead.
Can you can you say more about what that means? When you said "get out of the way," that struck something in me that, like, that sounds really important, but can you unpack a little bit about what that could look like? I'm not asking you to do our work for us, so if just as but, like, to get out of the way, like, I would assume that means, for example, we don't as men in public spaces, in conversations like that, we don't always have to have the last word. Is that one example of what that could look like?
I think it is.
Or maybe
Well,
speak at all?
yeah, and I'm thinking about the men I have seen do community-based work alongside women really well are men who have done a lot of
Mm,
didn't show up to those spaces to demand that women help them do their work as we do our work too. And I think there's a big difference there. I've felt it really strongly when someone has shown up to a space, ready to serve, ready to work, and they didn't come there for their own needs.
like,
And
had already been working on it before
yeah.
they yeah,
I think that's, and that's not just men. I think we all can be guilty of that. Especially in social work, especially in direct services. We're all, tend to be working through things as we go. But I think there's a difference between walking into these spaces with the expectation that the people there are going to fix things for you or heal things for you or make you feel better in the process. And I've seen some men come to this space that really have done their own work
yeah,
to try to figure out where some of their hurts are, to try to figure out how they want to show up in spaces. And they do that before they come to those spaces, which has always been where I've seen it go a little bit better.
yeah,
Uh, and, I have all this anger towards men, and lately it tends to be less human trafficking, and it tends to be more around natural resource extraction and this demand for land and property and ownership. Um, it's such a different way than I think most women think, and certainly different than most Indigenous people think. Um, but, I can say in that same vein, some of the most, um, I'm not really known for like crying when I speak. That's probably the anger part, really, because I'm usually on a rant about something. But some of the most emotional, meaningful times I have had as somebody who has shared my story or somebody who has publicly spoken about exploitation in Alaska, has been with um, seeing the young men, especially the young Native men sitting in the audience,
Mm,
and coming up to me afterwards and saying thank you, and not
right.
having a lot of like opinions or advice or recommendations, but just to be able to say like, I'm just really glad you're here and thank you for the work that you're doing. That has been really healing for me, because just showing up and listening is, um, I think it restores something for me that I don't even
Yeah.
know needs to be restored sometimes.
That's I think that's significant, just the way you said it too, just showing up and listening. I think something that is hard for men, just the way we're conditioned.
Well, I want to give you an example too of something that I think is really powerful. And I go back to some of our like traditional ways of being, traditional practices that are really grounding and important. And this ability women have to be nurturing, to be caretaking, to be able to solve really complex things, do really hard things. I think that's seen in a lot of cultures and societies. But I want to bring it back to my upbringing. So, actually, almost a year, um, yeah, a year this month, ago, my grandpa Alfred passed away. And, we had several days, weeks actually, where my aunt and I were doing hospice care for him. So my aunt's a hospice nurse. So we were taking care of him at home, which is what we have always done with our loved ones. And the men were out in the living room most of the time. And they were kind of doing stuff, doing chores every now and then, but the women were really busy and the women were up all night and the women were, you know, changing my grandpa and cleaning my grandpa and getting the medications. And, we were exhausted. We were so tired. Like,
Yeah,
Tom, I don't think I've ever been so tired in my life. Like, we hadn't slept in forever. Oh, I'm gonna get emotional. I
that's
just said
right.
I'm not a crier. But it's something about men will do this to me. And then my grandpa passed away actually the day before Thanksgiving. And It was such a beautiful passing. He had all of us around him. And there was kind of this feeling of like our work was done now. Like we had done this beautiful tending and caring and we were done and we were really tired. And my mom called one of the men from our community who has really taken it upon himself to teach traditional values and traditional things to young people. He called him to come over, and all of the men who had been sitting around, kind of almost sentinel, right? Like kind of not sitting around lazy, but sitting around just like being a presence, but knowing it wasn't necessarily their role to do the caretaking right now, but they were there. We knew they were there.
Yeah.
Um, Tom came in and then he got them ready for what their job was. And there was this really incredible experience of us women sitting out in the living room and we were just so tired. And Tom comes in, rounds up all the men and says, now it's your turn. And got a bucket of water, got clothes, and him and all of the men went into my grandpa's room and that was their job now,
Mm,
to dress him, to clean him. They had to do the heavy lifting, had to move him. They had to put all his winter gear on because in our culture, it's really important that you dress people for the weather. And so we wanted him dressed warm. And he taught them that, we don't dress people in fancy things. We won't put his beaded things on or regalia because where he's going, everybody needs to be equal footing. We don't want people to be dressed nicer than anyone else. And that's a really strong cultural value. And so they dressed him up in his warmest stuff and put all his layers on. And, I watched the men come out of the room when they were done, and they were just pouring sweat. My dad, my stepdad, my boyfriend, my brother, my cousin, these big men who up until then hadn't had a role. And they came out and they did this really big part. And I remember being so tired and thinking, God, I don't even think I could have done that. Like, we couldn't have done that. We're so tired. And that was just such an incredible example to me of like rerouting in what are our roles? What
Mm,
are our strengths? How do we work in conjunction with each other like
yeah,
that? And it gave those men like such a feeling of pride that like this was their job. Like now they were going to step in and take care of something that we didn't have the capacity to do. And there was just a balance to that that I think we miss in a lot of other spaces that we have. We don't have that balance.
that's so I'm not known for crying either, but I lost my dad the day after Thanksgiving too in 2019. So yeah, I've been in that room.
Yeah.
Um, but hearing you describe yeah, it's sacred respect for roles and patient and showing up, um, and presence. That's such a beautiful healing thing. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. Those kind of stories are so redemptive, it seems. You know,
Mhm.
I just, I've had the privilege of getting to know, I have several friends now, all of them, and I count you in this community as well, that are Indigenous survivors, and just the wisdom, um, the things that you all bring forward are such potent reminders of where I think so much healing can happen.
Yeah.
So I have so much respect for that. Yeah, when I start crying, I don't know where I get lost. Sorry. Yeah, that is so personally meaningful for me. I appreciate you sharing that. It's such a beautiful picture of what could be, right?
Mhm.
Or what ought to be. I had a friend describe justice as nothing more than contending for what ought to be,
Mhm.
and that's, to me, that's such a beautiful picture of that.
Yeah.
Uh, are there you already spoken frequently now about just some of your cultural traditional practices and customs. Like, are there other practices and customs that have really sustained you doing this hard work? I know you also do it for fame and glory and riches, but besides that, what are what are some of the things just from your culture and traditions that are really rooting for you, that keep you grounded?
Yeah, I think it's that relational piece, and it's taken me a really long time actually to understand that as a value for myself and understand that as like what actually has kept me um alive and going and hopeful my entire life, even when I didn't understand that it was relational care and like a relational way of being. Um But I think there's, if you go about the world, and I remember being, 17, 18, 19 years old, and it was me against the world, and I was alone, and it was a dark and scary place for me. Um, when you go about the world in that individualistic way, when you don't deeply see the way that you are connected to each other, and to the land, and to the water, and to everything around us, and when we don't have that sense of connection, we have so much isolation and so much grief in that, right? Like, what is then the meaning of anything? We're out here just kind of wandering around. And I think service and relational care has been something that I've always felt my best in. I always get the most energy when I see um, and so I do, we talk a lot about self-care in this field, and we sometimes kind of, hit each other over the heads with hammers, especially in the mental health field. We're always like, here's your eight eight clients a day, 40 hours a week, plus do your notes, but also do self-care, right?
What a
Uh
grind.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think community care has been a really big part of my wellness. And that goes back to that relational piece, right? That like um understanding that like you being well in this work, Tom, is just as important as me being well in this. And if you're not well, I'm not well. Like we have to be seeing each other as part of a greater picture together. And I think that goes back to the gender conversation of how we show up in the work. That like when our men are not well, we are not well either. When our women are not well, our men are not well, and that starting to see things through that relational lens has been really reassuring and really hopeful for me. Um, and yeah, I think allowing emotion and allowing anger, like for us to even be able to have this conversation, and for me, to say some of the things that, in other rooms, someone might say, well, how dare you? Or, like for you to even hold some things that, I say that, are undoubtedly uncomfortable to hear. But you held it and you're here and you're listening. Um, there's something really powerful about that connection part. And I tell people, um, I always tell people I do human trafficking trainings, and then they get me in the room and I'll talk about literally everything but human trafficking. Intentionally, but that's my key to get into the room.
Yeah.
Uh, but I always tell people it's not the books that you write, it's not the presentations that you do, it's not your only measure of impact in the world is who you are every day and the way that you are with everyone and everything around you. And I remember, um, times in my life feeling the lowest or the most scared or the most, I guess, down. And it wasn't an organization, it wasn't a book, it wasn't a program that did anything for me. It was just someone being nice.
Uh,
Like we overestimate how important that is to just look people in the eye and smile at them. You know, I can't remember most of my experience as a younger person when I encountered harm. That most of that is pretty blurry, but I vividly remember the people. Whether it was a grocery store clerk or someone outside of a gas station or just a stranger. I vividly remember, even if it wasn't an act of kindness, just an acknowledgement of existence. I tell people in our trainings here all the time, especially law enforcement, that I think they have a really, they have a tough job, and I have many gripes with them too. But at the end of the day, they're asked to do something that's really difficult to do, and almost all systems prevent them from doing it well, especially when we talk about human trafficking.
yeah, that's true.
But the takeaway of the training is if you can go out into the world and you can treat people with dignity and you can treat people with respect and you can look people in the eye and you can joke with people and you can laugh with people and you can just show that human connection and relation and that relational mindset, like you are absolutely changing the world. Absolutely, hands down. And we make it really complicated sometimes.
Yeah. That's so life-giving to hear that as a man, because I think we're often conditioned to want to fix everything. But what you're saying is it can be as simple. It's not the total solution, but it's a contribution that is meaningful to, like you said, look someone in the eye, to say a kind word. That's really that feels really accessible, really doable.
Accessible. Yeah.
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 What role, a couple more questions, but what role for you does the um, experience of and cultivation of beauty for you in this work? Like just personally, like what you live in, what is for me one of the most beautiful places on the planet, and I am inspired by all of that. Is it that? Is it music? Is it art? Like what
Mhm.
role do we play in being healthy and showing
Yeah.
up whole in those ways?
I'm super glad you asked that because it was actually on my mind to talk about that today. And it goes back to that accessibility piece of that sometimes we overcomplicate what anti trafficking or anti violence can look like. And sometimes we even overcomplicate what our role can be. And I want to give you an example of how transformational beauty is and how important all of our roles are in society, whether they're in social work or victim advocacy or something completely different. Um, but I want to go back to experience in high school. And the summer, I was 17 years old, summer before my senior year, had some really hard and traumatic things happen. And I feel so privileged. Privilege is the wrong word. Overwhelmed, actually, still when I think about it. That I look back on my senior year of high school, which could have and should have been one of the hardest points of my life. And it wasn't. And it wasn't because there's one reason, one person it wasn't. And I tell her this every time I see her, but Jody Jenkins, if you're listening, I had a high school art teacher
Mm.
who, I don't know if she knew something was off with me. I went to a K through 12 school, so she had known me a really long time, like fourth grade on. I don't know if she intuitively picked up something or it's just who she was as a person. But my senior year, I pretty much skipped every class and I just lived in the art room. And she gave me full access to a pottery wheel and whatever glazes I need and no limit to anything. And so my senior year was the year that I became a potter.
Wow.
And was the year that I discovered a love for ceramics. And man, that could have been anything else, right? That my senior year could have been defined by so many other things because of the hurt that I was carrying that year. And instead, I can look around my relative's house and see like, oh, I remember when I made that. And like I could see my grandma's bowl that she used to use to make blueberry pancakes that I made her my senior year. That's decorated with blueberries and has a little spout for her to pour the batter. And that was what I made. That was the beautiful thing that I was allowed to have access to that defined not just who I was then, but who I am today. Like this evening, I will go to the pottery studio where I still find that access to beauty and creation. I don't think it was the medium of pottery that was transformational for me. It was the act of kindness of just allowing me to be in that space.
I'm imagining a caring, compassionate high school art teacher, a guy who wants to make a difference and, like,
Yeah.
yeah, you don't have to be a social justice
No,
warrior,
you don't.
good art teacher.
Yes, and it's all of those roles, and I think about, I have basketball coaches that were, phenomenal at teaching me confidence, teaching me, that I could overcome things, that even if it was just the physical pain of running sprints, I could do it. And it's all of those little roles, and, for men out there listening, I think especially if, any of this fuels up some type of fire. Like, you don't have to necessarily change careers or go in a different direction, but like what you're doing now matters. What you're doing every day matters. And you have the ability um, to heal your own communities, to heal parts of yourself, of your ancestry. Like that's all possible. And the other thing, I think is so important for people to hear. I talk a lot about like Indigenous values and practices. And one of the coolest presentations I went to recently was actually a man who, I can't for the life of me remember his name, but he was talking about how he had kind of rediscovered some roots in Ireland.
Mm,
And through that rediscovery, had learned about some ceremonial practices for young men that were meant to help support kind of the change into young adult to being a man in your community. And he talked about how, we he recognized that he was missing a lot of that. And so my kind of call to people is these types of values and practices. I think if you look at any civilization across the world, before we get into more modern times, they exist in lots of different ways.
yeah, yeah,
And I think that we can all reconnect to those things. This isn't an Indigenous practice that belongs only to Indigenous people. Like this way of seeing the world, this way of ceremony, of practices to acknowledge each other and acknowledge roles shows up in lots of different ways. And so um, I think maybe give yourself permission to reconnect with parts that are lost, to find the things that resonate with you. I think there's a lot of possibility for people out there.
yeah. It's such a helpful orienting, thing. When before we started recording, you insisted that you wanted to talk about where you are from, and I think that's whether it's full of trauma or full of, love and affection, or it's
Mhm.
usually the case it's both, right? Like I think reflecting on and paying attention to where we are from, it feels like a good place to start.
Mhm.
I'm looking at I have a piece of sugar cane that came from the mill floor in rural Cuba, in the mill that my grandfather ran, that my great grandfather built, that my dad grew up in the shadow of. And it's just like, it just looks like a dried up stick, but like it's been for me over the years such a potent reminder, like this is where I come from. And I think that's just a great encouragement, I think, to hear you say that. And it
Mhm.
that it's not, these are indigenous practices and customs, because I think in many ways you guys are the ones that have kept this alive,
Mhm.
not just for indigenous people, right? I mean, they're valuable because they're human. They're
Yeah.
universal. I that's so helpful.
Well, and I
You
think back to the anger part too. Like, I think it's fully worth acknowledging that, like, um, maybe not for everybody, but for me, I will insist upon introducing myself in that traditional way, not just as a cultural practice, but as an act of resistance.
mm,
And the acknowledgement that for generations that grandparents' generation was taught to never do that, to not speak in your language, to it was beaten out of them to be Indian, to be Alaska Native, to be Indigenous, and
yeah,
so being
that was
able
federal policy, right? I mean, at
yeah,
one,
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And the federal policy part, like, God, I can go on a whole other tangent about this, but we we look at the federal policy that included just the extraction of, one of the methods to kill off Indian people was to reduce their food sources and to kill off, how many thousands of bison and buffalo were killed, and with the sheer intent of taking away the food source of Native American people.
Yeah.
Like, this extraction, this mutilation, this extinction of our resources has been systematically used to try to destroy a whole population of people. And so when it shows up in modern day, when we have our communities here protesting things like Pebble Mine and the Ambler Road Project, like, that's that same fight. Like, we haven't stopped fighting that fight. And it's important for people to remember that this isn't just generational trauma. Like, when I show up and say I am Mary and Paul Starr's granddaughter and I am Alfred Miller's granddaughter, I'm saying that because we're still in that fight.
Mm,
And we still have things that are and societies and structures and systems that are actively trying to destroy the things that are important to us and trying to destroy who we are. So
yeah.
I think that's a really important part of this.
What is hopeful for you right now?
Um,
Career in your life and in the work that you're doing, what gives you hope?
couple things give me hope. One is that I think one of the most inspirational moments I had, I think Kristen talked about it on the episode she was on, but I was appointed to the um, U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking under President Biden, and um, I had the privilege of getting to go to the President's Interagency Task Force meeting on human trafficking, which was in D.C. It was all the heads of the PITF agencies and the ambassador for human trafficking to the department. So it was a very prestigious event. A lot of suits, a lot of security, a lot of DC. And I got to sit at that table with my giant beaded earrings on, and um, everyone kind of went around the table and introduced themselves, and then I took about 6 minutes to introduce myself, which was just like so cool and inspirational for me. That just, like, for this moment, like, I'm gonna take up some space and I'm gonna tell you about who my grandma is, and I'm gonna tell you about the place that I come from, and I'm gonna tell you about who I am and why I'm here today. And that was really inspirational to me, that I think the more we can continue to show up within systems, the more that we can continue to show up in spaces and be, like, I love the name disruptors, because we have to disrupt these patterns. and getting moments to do that, to shake it up, to make people even a little uncomfortable and say, here we are with our, as Abigail Adcock would say, with our big, bold, beautiful ideas, and we're not going away.
Yeah.
That's really hopeful and inspirational to me. I think another thing that really brought me a lot of hope recently, after you and I saw each other in Florida, um, came home and a pretty major typhoon had impacted our coastal communities in Western Alaska, which displaced a lot of people. And so I had spent some time down at the emergency shelters, which were convention centers, and it was my first time interacting with a Red Cross scenario where there's kind of this state response, and they have a very specific way of doing things, and it's kind of how they've done it everywhere. And I wasn't quite sure what to expect, but what gave me hope was the first couple of days were really hard. We had a lot of Alaska Native people in the space, a lot of Alaska Native leadership as well. And what we were seeing immediately was this is not how we do things.
Mm.
This scarcity of giving is not how we do things. We don't put security at the door. We welcome people in.
Yeah.
Um, we have closed donations. They need to all actually be out here for everyone to see and access. You can't hide them behind a desk. Like, people need to feel abundance. We need to treat people with love and care through abundance. That's how we take care of each other.
Yeah.
Food needs to be good food from where we come from, because that's also how we take care of each other. We need to also have translators here so that people can be spoken to in their language, because that's respectful. We need chairs for our elders. And the first couple days were really hard because we had these, it was mostly folks from the lower 48 who'd never been to Alaska, and they were in the convention center. Like, what are you talking about? And we had a lot of tense moments of like,
Mm.
it was me, I was causing tense moments, but times of like, hey, you can't talk to people like that, or you shouldn't treat people like that, or having security at the front door is sending a really weird message, or like these armbands feel a little, you know, there was a relational piece that was super missing. And
Yeah.
it took us a couple days, and it took us some tension going back and forth before we got to a point where some major changes were made in how the service was delivered within the shelter. And then something really cool happened, is that those Red Cross people stopped being enforcers of a system and started to be just people with other people.
Yeah.
And you were seeing like the sweet older women from South Carolina, like toting around babies on their hips and laughing and having a good, because we removed these systemic barriers. We removed this process of how it should be done. And we said, no, we're actually just here to love up on each other. Like, we're supposed to feel love for each other right now. We're not just supposed to feel charity. And we don't want to feel charity. We don't want you to feel that you're in a role to provide charity. You're in a role to provide love and compassion. That's amazing. Like, what if you just got to do that?
Yeah.
And so by the end of it, it was like, I had some of the Red Cross workers telling me this has been one of my favorite experiences, because I think they got to do what they wanted to do when they originally signed up, which was just take good care of people.
Yeah.
And not just give with scarcity, but be abundant and provide all the things they wanted to provide. And it was such a different model of care that I think a lot of them weren't used to. And then I remember when people were leaving, they were sharing like pictures of like they met up with some of the families after and went to dinner, and they like took some cool scenic pictures together. Like, they have lifelong friends and connections from this experience that if things had continued on the original path, I don't think they would be there. And so I think the more that we are able to teach each other this relational care, this um, giving without expectation, this non-transactional type of way of being with each other, um, that's so healing for everybody
Yeah.
involved.
Yeah. I want to give you the last word, but if I could you speak it to men?
Mm.
What is what is what is something, just in light of this conversation and the issues, whatever the things that have come up, like, what's your last word to men?
Mm. Gosh, yeah, it's an interesting point of reflection for me to recognize that I have to fight through a lot of negative things to get to something that feels good. Um, And I think that might be my last word for men, is just the recognition that, um, and I won't speak for all women, but, um, when I show up in spaces and men are there, it's not an immediate leap of trust.
Mm,
It's not an immediate connection. Like even with my years of clinical training, even if my years of my own mental health therapy, there is still 5 or 6 hurdles to jump over before there's trust. And that might not have anything to do with you. And it might be something I'm not even presently aware of all the time, but it's hard.
yeah.
And, I like to think of myself as somebody who has always really tried to embrace community, and making sure everyone is at the table and that and actually maybe just get rid of the table because whose table is it anyways? But um, it's hard to recognize that underneath my knowledge of this is all of our work lies a lot of hurt still.
Still.
And and so I think that's my message, is just maybe not to fix it, because I don't think there's anything anyone in that moment can do to fix it, but maybe just have that awareness and that knowledge that for many, um, it might take some hurdles to get there.
Yeah.
Um, and that could be true about my own experiences or the experiences of, the women in my family and my grandmother and Lauren touched on this before we started the podcast, but one of the reasons I ever started even sharing my experiences and talking publicly was in the midst of oh gosh, it was years ago now, but my grandma used to be one of those grandmas that shared absolutely everything on Facebook constantly, which was adorable. And also, I don't know that she could see that when she commented on somebody, we could all see it. So she had this really funny period where, like, she would follow the Obamas, and anybody who commented something negative, she would, like, reply to them and tell them, like, they needed to find something better to do with their time, which was just adorable because she's, like, living in rural Alaska just on her iPad, just, like,
Oh, funny.
responding to everyone. But I remember one day that I had gotten on Facebook and, she had shared, it was in the middle of the Me Too movement, had shared a post, and she just wrote "Me Too." And I remember having this, like, moment of clarity that I
Mm,
think every woman I know is holding that.
mm,
Every woman I know is holding that, whether it was myself or my sisters or my aunties or my grandmas, we are holding that. And I think that's something that there needs to be an awareness of and an acknowledgement of, that that is such a complex and deep pain.
yeah.
Um, and it doesn't mean don't be in this work. It doesn't mean don't keep showing up and doing what you're doing. Um, but the recognition that trust isn't immediate, um, and maybe even that mindfulness of, is that going back to a more colonial mindset of the expectation of something belonging to you already, even if that's just trust.
Josie Heyano, your wisdom exceeds your years.
Mm.
Thank for thank you for this time.
Yeah, thank you. I hope it wasn't too heavy. There was some light in there too. I really appreciate the opportunity to get to talk about my community. There's a lot of beautiful things here, and there's a lot of beautiful things across the nation. And I think those beautiful things are people doing really small things to make the world a much better place.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.